frankly, my preference would be just to have a discussion section, but Mike, the boss, told me he wants a little more structure and form. So I'll start talking a little, but if you'll do me a favor if you interrupt as soon as possible, because I have nothing particular I would like, go in any direction. And that'll get me off the hook with Mike, which is the main thing. The reason is pretty straightforward. I mean, we're all sort of, I think everybody's at a state where you don't have to listen to any more speeches, and pursuing questions that are interesting to you would be more interested both for me and you. A little form. A point where a good point to start maybe is, since this is the 50th anniversary is with George Orwell's book Animal Farm, just 50 years ago, which everybody read, of course, I assume. And everyone read it as what it is, namely a satirical commentary on a totalitarian state, on communist Russia, Leninist and Stalinist Russia, which is indeed correct. It's the way it's presented, that's what indeed it was. However, there was another little aspect to Orwell, to that book. He wrote an introduction to it, which was about England. He was writing in England, of course. And in the introduction, he said that the introduction incidentally wasn't published. It came out about 30 years later, separately. But somebody found it in some paper somewhere after he was famous. But in the introduction, he said that he's writing the books about control of thought and speech and so on under totalitarianism. But he said what are called free societies, it doesn't come out that much different. And he gave England as an example. And he said that in England, there are other techniques. There isn't any state control that ensures there's no big brother and, none of this stuff. But the end result comes out more or less the same. And he said that people who have dissenting opinions or critical opinions find themselves very effectively silenced. And then he discussed the mechanisms a little, and he didn't go into it in any detail, it's just a preface to a book, but he mentioned two mechanisms. One, he said, is that the press is by and large owned by wealthy people, wealthy men actually, he said, there are certain ideas they just don't want expressed. So they're going to make sure that those things don't get talked about. And that's one factor. And the second factor is essentially socialization. He said when you go through the establishment educational and cultural system, if you come out of it in a position where you can enter into the world of affairs, you have already internalized the understanding that there are certain things that you just don't say. And he said that's more effective than any external control. And the effect of these two things is that though there's no direct force applied and no threat even, nevertheless the effect is not dissimilar to what you would find under a totalitarian system. And as I mentioned, more or less to illustrate his thesis, the introduction was not published with the book. You can now find it. These two factors that he identified are pretty much accurate, and you have to expand them, of course. It's not simply that the press is owned by wealthy men, but there's a whole complex institutional structure which includes ownership and includes advertisers and includes other power centers in the society and so on and so forth. And the end result of the interaction of these things is that it's going to be extremely hard for material to appear, or points of view to appear, or even facts to appear often, that are of the kind that they would find harmful to their interests, which is not terribly surprising. Why should anyone be expected to finance or support the kind of work which is going to undermine their power? I mean, it's not a law of nature that doesn't happen, but it happens so rarely as to be essentially insignificant. And in order to expand Orwell's point, you want to look into the institutional structures and so on, and that's not just the press. I mean, the same is true of, say, the universities. So, for example, universities are parasitic institutions. They don't generate their own resources, and that means that they They certainly don't live on student tuition, which means they survive by virtue of the services that they perform to the external sources of wealth and capital and power, which means rich alumni and corporations and state power and so on, all very closely linked up. So naturally, the university product is not, is not by and large going to be contrary to what would be in the interests of the funders, of the people who are paying the paycheck ultimately. And the same is true of the school system, even down to local schools, where there's again always a network of sharp inequality of power and capital, which is going to influence and very severely influence what will happen. So there'll be training for obedience and lack of questioning and subordination to power and so on and so forth. And out of all these things comes as you work your way through this, you either reject it, in which case you tend to be rejected by the system as an kind of like a foreign object who it doesn't want to maintain within it, a harmful foreign object which is kind of ejected, and you can try to survive on the margins, or else you stay within the system, meaning you have absorbed and internalized the values and the understanding, and at that point it doesn't matter much whether there's any coercive power or not. So, liberal columnists in the press, like people like Tom Wicker, to mention one who made a big fuss about this, when they're criticized for subordination to power, they say very irately that nobody tells me what to write, and that's completely true. Nobody would bother to tell them what to write. But the point is, they would never get to the point where they would even have these openings and opportunities unless they had already demonstrated that their own understanding is so limited and subordinated to authentic power interests that there's no problem letting them write without anybody telling them what to write. If they ever did something different, they would be out. Now, that's, again, not an iron law, so there are people who manage to work within the system, like Barbara Ehrenreich, who was here last week, to some extent, and there are options, and the options are doubtless worth pursuing, but anyone who does it, and there are a number of people in the media who do it very self-consciously and with a very critical and sophisticated understanding of the way the media work, just kind of looking for little openings and holes here and there, but it's limited. I mean, something gets through. Maybe it's certainly worth pursuing to its limits, as it is any system of coercion. But you can predict pretty well what the output's going to be. You simply understand what kind of things there are to be said, what are to be said, and what kind of things are not to be said. And failure to understand that, by and large, excludes you from the system. Okay, and the end result, exactly as Orwell said, is a media output which is not dramatically different. It's different from a totalitarian state, but not dramatically different. In fact, when you begin to look closely, it's not so clear whether it's more open or less open. So take, say, Orwell's example, Russia, as close to a pure totalitarian state as we have in the modern world, up until recently. There were studies done by U.S. Russian research centers, government institutions about 10 or 15 years ago, and they're trying to figure out what Russians read and look at. Now, the actual press that they saw was very narrowly controlled. It's the kind of thing that Orwell caricatures. On the other hand, that's not what they were limited to. So, for example, it turned out, according to these analyses, that about over 3/4 of the population listened to foreign broadcasts, foreign news broadcasts, like BBC, say. They broke it down into more educated and less educated, so, sort of professional, educated types. It was about 95% listening to foreign broadcasts, meaning getting Western news as their main news source. With regard to reading material, they estimated that about half the population, I think it was some number like that, I have a number somewhere, was reading Samizdat, Z Magazine, that kind of thing. And of blue-collar workers, it was about 15%. Well, you compare that with the United States. What percentage of the population listens to foreign broadcasts, let's say, to get some meaning something other than our line. Remember, BBC is not very different from our propaganda system. Something outside the framework of the Western propaganda system. First of all, you wouldn't know where to listen. You have to listen to something from Mars because there isn't anything else. Domination of the airwaves is so total that there just isn't anything outside the frame. So marginal you couldn't find it. When the Third World tried to develop, and this is taken to be very significant. So, like you may recall, about 15 years ago, there was an effort on the part of UNESCO, which represents largely third world interests, to start what they called a new world, what they call New World Information Order, I think it was called, to try to develop resources that would enable third world countries, the countries of the South, to have their own input into the global information system. Well, the West took this very seriously. In fact, the United States virtually destroyed UNESCO in order to prevent this from happening. The monopoly on the global media is something that's taken extremely seriously, and nobody's going to be allowed in. And that stopped. There's an interesting book about it if you want to find out how it worked by William Preston, Edward Herman, and Herb Schiller have a book called Hope and Folly, I think, which goes through not only what happened, but the enormous media campaign and the lies and so on and so forth to try to kill this thing, which of course they killed. So there is nowhere else to turn. So there's no issue of looking for another source. So that's there. We don't have the options that they had. With regard to Samizdat, sort of underground press, which means things like laissez. I don't know what the percentage of the population is, but it's not 50%. We're sure of that. In fact, if it reaches 0.001%, we'd be kind of excited, I think. But and what that tells you is that although it's perfectly true that the media themselves are not pravda by any means, nevertheless the range of alternatives may well turn out to be less than that was available to citizens of a totalitarian state in, say, the Brezhnev era. And there are other factors that also ought to be looked at. In a totalitarian state, the propaganda is fairly obvious. There's not much attempt made to hide the fact that it's propaganda. It almost comes labeled Ministry of Truth. The reason is pretty straightforward. There's enough force in the background, so it really doesn't matter that much what people think. There's a lot they're going to do about it anyway. So therefore, you don't have to be subtle and sophisticated about making them believe. You just have to make them obey. On the other hand, in a society like ours, where there's a lot that people can do, and the coercive powers of the state are much more restricted, it's extremely important what people think, and that's been understood for a long time. Therefore, the methods of indoctrination and thought control have to be much more sophisticated and much more intensive. And indeed, there's a huge industry in the United States, public relations industry, which is designed for this purpose. It's a big part of the business world is specifically devoted to controlling, well, the way they put it back in the early days of the century, controlling the public mind. And the reason is because it was understood, as again the business press put it, that the public mind is the greatest hazard to industrialists. It's the real threat to corporate power, and therefore it's extremely important to control the public mind. Now, control the public mind doesn't just mean inculcate the right beliefs. In fact, that's a minor part of it. The major part of it is make you the right kind of person. And the right kind of person is one who cares only for yourself, doesn't see any hope or any purpose even in doing anything, interacting with others, or any way of doing it if you wanted to, and is just an atom of consumption and a tool of production. If you can get people to that point, where they're atoms of consumption and tools of production, and there's nothing else in their mental universe, then it doesn't matter a lot what they believe. Like they can think the whole system stinks and so on and so forth, but it doesn't matter because they're glued to maximizing their own personal consumption and wealth, even if they don't want it, because that's the only thing that's around. And they take orders because that's assumed that that's what you do. You take orders. It was not easy to, and the major effort of the propaganda. This is something where, say, the work that Herman and I did is really defective. We don't talk about this much, but this is a major part of the indoctrination and propaganda system, and it's really what's directed the most of the population. And it's been a battle. If you look back over the history of this thing, it's interesting. mentioned earlier today some of the stuff from the early days of the Industrial Revolution. But if you look back, there used to be a very lively labor press. In fact, not too long ago. But in the 19th century, it was very lively and independent. It was mostly people who didn't have much education. But for years, they were kind of struggling against. They were expressing the feelings of people who were struggling against this major effort to turn people into precisely this, into what's required by the capitalist ethic, namely no human values, no sense of solidarity, no sense of sympathy with other people. Got to drive all of this out of people's heads, and you have to turn them into objects who only want to maximize personal welfare in a very narrow sense of welfare. It doesn't mean like well-being, or happiness or satisfaction of your life or anything. It just means pile up the commodities high enough. That's welfare, and you do it just for yourself, not for anybody else. And you got to drive out of people's heads all the natural human feelings. At the production end, you have to turn them into people who are basically willing to accept what in the 19th century was called wage slavery, which is exactly what it is. You have to be willing to accept the idea that there's nothing else around except following orders. So you follow orders most of the day, and then you consume things you don't want the rest of the day. That's basically it. This was not easy to achieve, and it takes, if you look back at the 19th century literature, workers and farmers and so on who were struggling against this system didn't particularly complain about the low wages and that sort of thing, but about the fact that it was degrading. The word that comes up over and over again, in the literature is it's degrading, it's demeaning, we're losing our liberty, we thought we fought for freedom and now we're slaves and so on and so forth. Those are the things that come up over and over again, and you've got to make sure a large part of the propaganda system, indoctrination system, is to drive those concepts out of people's heads so you don't feel it's degrading to take orders, because what alternative is there than taking orders? And you don't see anything odd about piling up commodities, because what else is it a life except piling up commodities? To turn people into that took like a century. It wasn't easy. Same in England. We see a lot of the early days of the Industrial Revolution, right up till not too long ago, are rather striking in that respect. So an awful lot of propaganda goes to that. If you actually take a look at the media product, most of it is that kind of thing. Inculcating beliefs is a small part of it, and it's pretty localized. It's mostly the kind of stuff, say, that Ed and I study is the inculcating beliefs part. That's really directed to elites. That's why we looked at things like the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on, which are really directed to what people sometimes call the political class. The small sector of the population is supposed to be involved in making decisions and analysis and planning and that kind of stuff. They have to have the right beliefs because you got to make sure that they make decisions in such a way that subordinates them to power. And those of us who, say, went through elite educational schools training, like most of us did, I suppose, we're part of that thing. You got to shape your mind properly. For most people, you just have to destroy their mind. It's not necessarily, it doesn't matter if you shape it properly. In this sense, Orwell's picture is, I think, basically correct, and there has been quite a change. It's intriguing. If you take a field like economics and look at what was, you take, say, a pre-capitalist thinker like Adam Smith, who really was pre-capitalist, and take a contemporary Nobel Prize winner in economics, and their conception of what human beings are is just radically different. You look at Adam Smith, the real Adam Smith, not the fake one created by the ideologists. He assumed that the basic human emotions were things like sympathy and solidarity and support for one another and that sort of thing. He did give arguments for the market, that's true, but he argued for the market on the grounds that it was going to lead to equality. He said the argument wasn't very good, but the point, it tells you what the point was, what he was after. He said he gives a long argument to try to show that under conditions of what he called perfect liberty, which meant real market, the kind of market that we don't have, like free movement of labor and that sort of thing. Under perfect liberty, there would be a tendency toward perfect equality, and that's the condition under which you would have efficient market function, and that's why it's a good thing to a limited extent. He also said it can't let it, you have to control it, or it leads to all sorts of horrible things. But the idea that humans crucially need and have a right to equality and solidarity and sympathy and creative work and work that they control and so on and so forth. That's just at the core of, Adam Smith's approach to economic issues. Economic health from that point of view would mean the welfare, the achievement of the fulfillment of human needs and rights. That's economic health. When you get to the modern period, it's changed radically. The only value is, your only right, really, is the rights that you can get by selling your labor power in the market. There are no other rights. There's no right to life, And there's a big battle about this in the 19th century to try to prove that there is no right other than the rights you get on the market. It's against, you read, by the time you get to David Ricardo and so on, it's an attack on natural liberty and on the laws of nature that to claim, to make people believe, to delude people into thinking they have other rights, like a right to live. You don't have that. If you don't have, if you can't sell your labor power on the market, then go somewhere else. That was exactly what was said. Go somewhere else meant go to America or Australia or something. Remember, these are periods of free movement of labor, and the whole theory is based on that. By the time you get to the modern period, it gets really weird. Take somebody like, say, James Buchanan, who's a recent Nobel Prize winner. I guess he's a Chicago economist. Yeah. His idea is that the core of human nature, he said, for each person, he says, the ideal situation would be to be the master of a world of slaves. That's what each of us really wants, in case you didn't know. And since we can't really have that, well, okay, we have to settle for various kinds of interactions and so on. Now, that's a point of view that somebody like a pre-capitalist thinker like, say, Adam Smith would have considered completely pathological, which of course it is. But in order to turn people from the kind of people who, say, somebody like Adam Smith is talking about, to creatures whose ideal world would be to be master of a world of slaves, that's taken a lot of work. It's probably worked pretty well among educated sectors, but there's certainly have been successes among the general population, and that's mainly what the indoctrination is about. For educated folks like us, it's to make sure we have the right beliefs. Well, turning to that sector, the narrow sector of people in the political class, the decision makers, whether in business world or the ideological system or political system or whatever, there is, as Orwell correctly pointed out, it is extremely important to make sure that people who get through only think the right thoughts, never think the wrong thoughts. And the extent to which this has been achieved is pretty remarkable. Actually, that's what most of the empirical work is about, trying to just show how that works out in practice, and it's pretty astonishing. I mean, you find results which very often you couldn't duplicate in a totalitarian state. This happens over and over. There are so many cases. It's almost, here's where we really want to look at cases, see how it works. But let me just mention a couple of examples which are as good of a general nature, not specific things like how they handled the Gulf War or something. So, for example, one major issue now, which has devastated a good bit of the left and has caused enormous triumphalism elsewhere, is the alleged fact that there's been this great battle between socialism and capitalism won and socialism lost. And the reason it lost is because the Soviet Union turned out to be a failure. And that shows that socialism is lost, so you have big articles in The Nation, cover stories on the end of socialism, and you have people who all their lives considered themselves anti-Stalinists, saying, okay, socialism is lost because Russia's collapsed and so on. Well, in order to believe, that's the kind of thing you must think. And to raise questions about that is something you mustn't think. But suppose you do what you're not allowed to do. Suppose you ask some simple questions, like take, say, the first question. In what sense did the Soviet Union fail? The story is supposed to be that the Soviet Union is a failure and the West is a success. Well, by what criterion? Is it, you read, the standard answer is, well, look how rich we are and look how poor they are. But by that argument, you could prove that, say, the Cambridge kindergartens are a failure because kids who graduate from Cambridge kindergarten don't know as much quantum physics as people who get their PhDs in physics at MIT. So therefore, the Cambridge kindergarten's a failure. Well, it's a pretty stupid argument, obviously. But notice it's exactly the same argument. If you want to ask whether, just from an economic point of view, did the Soviet system fail, there's no point comparing it with, you have to take something that was like it when the experiment started. I mean, the reason why the argument about the Cambridge elementary schools is stupid is because the kids who enter elementary school don't know as much physics as the kids who enter MIT PhD physics department. Okay, so obviously a ridiculous experiment. So you have to take countries that were like the Soviet Union back around the early part of the century. Or else you have to go back, try to find a time when Eastern and Western Europe were alike. Well, that's not very useful because the last time Eastern and Western Europe were alike was about the 14th century, so that's not a big help. In fact, they started separating, pre-Columbian period, with Eastern Europe becoming the third world of Western Europe. It's third world, that's what it was, right into the early part of the century. Deeply impoverished third world service area for the West, which developed while the East underdeveloped in the standard fashion. So take places that were like the Soviet Union, say, what now is the Soviet Union, say in 1910. Oh, you can find places like that. And then you'd have but stayed in the Western sphere. That would be a comparison. And there certainly are places, like a natural comparison would be, say, Brazil. Brazil is a very rich country, extraordinary resources, no enemies, much better off than the Soviet Union in that respect. Nobody invaded it, nobody attacked it. It was the recipient of a tremendous investment and great support from, in fact, the United States has been running it for 60 years. Since 1945, the U.S. took it over as what was called a testing area for scientific methods of economic development by the principles of American capitalism. That's what it was described as in 1945 when U.S. technocrats started running the place and telling them how to do it scientifically and so on. So they had every possible advantage. So in fact, the comparison with the Soviet Union is maybe not fair in that respect. It's unfair to the Soviet Union. Well, compare Eastern Europe and Brazil, let's say. The comparison is not straightforward entirely, but you can make a comparison. What you find is that in Brazil, maybe 10% of the population would regard Eastern Europe as a horror chamber, and maybe 90% of the population would regard Eastern Europe as a paradise. Roughly speaking, that's the story. Well, who succeeded and who failed? Now that's, there's nothing complicated about this about this kind of reasoning. In fact, any child could figure out that this is the only reasonable comparison to carry out. Try to find somebody who's carried it out. Well, that's the kind of thought you're not supposed to have. You're not supposed to realize that to ask about the economic success of the Soviet Union by comparing it to the United States or Germany or France is like asking about a comparison of the success of Cambridge kindergartens and the Cambridge physics and the MIT physics department in teaching quantum physics. You're not allowed to think that. Not that it's a hard thought, it's an elementary and trivial thought, but it's the kind of thought that can't come into your mind. And if it comes into your mind, you're out of the system. So try to find some discussion of this in, let's say, The Nation or the National Review or anything in between. Out. Not elementary rationality of the most simple kind is just unthinkable. And unless you have that in your bones, you're not part of the system. In that respect, Orwell's totally right. Actually, there's a secondary point that one might ask, and that is why do people like, say, Robert Heilbrunner or the Nation editors or whatever say that socialism failed? Why don't they say that democracy failed? And the proof that democracy failed is, look what happened to Eastern Europe. I mean, after all, those countries called themselves democratic. In fact, they called themselves people's democracies, kind of real advanced forms of democracy. So why don't we conclude that democracy failed? Well, I haven't seen any article anywhere saying, look, democracy failed. I mean, let's forget about democracy. And it's obvious why. The fact that they called themselves democratic doesn't say that they were democratic. Pretty obvious. Well, in what sense did socialism fail? I mean, certainly it's true that they called themselves socialists, but they also called themselves democratic. Were they socialists? I mean, for example, whatever, you can argue about what socialism is, but there's some ideas that are at the core of it, like workers' control over production or elimination of wage labor and things like that. Did they have that? I mean, it wasn't even a thought. In fact, there were in the pre-revolutionary, in the pre-Bolshevik period, there were, in fact, initiatives, there were socialist initiatives. They were crushed instantly. I mean, within months, they were crushed. In fact, just as whatever moves there were toward democracy were instantly destroyed, whatever moves there were toward socialism were equally instantly destroyed. The Bolshevik takeover was sort of a coup, which was a counter-revolution. Well, we certainly understand this easily enough with regard to the claim to democracy. How come we don't understand it with regard to the claim to socialism? In fact, why isn't the question even asked? Well, because anybody who would think of asking the question is out of the system. Now, it's not that it wasn't understood. It was perfectly well understood at the time. So if you look even at the mainstream of the Marxist movement at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Bolshevik takeover was regarded as counter-revolutionary. If you look at independent leftists like Bertrand Russell, it was instantly obvious. If you look at the libertarian left, it was a truism. But this truism had to be driven out of people's heads. It's very valuable for the West to be able to claim that that stuff over there was socialism, because that way you can undercut moves towards change in the social system by saying, oh, well, that's socialism, and look what it leads to. You know? So therefore very useful, and only if that is in your bones are you even allowed into the system. Well, again, it's a trivial question. If you can ask whether whether democracy failed, you can also ask whether socialism failed, but not if you want to be published in a spectrum that runs from, say, the nation over to, far right as you feel like going, meaning everywhere. That's the kind of result that's, and these are trivial questions. These aren't hard questions. These are questions that ought to come to people's mind instantly if they have like a third-grade education in a reasonable system. They don't come to anybody's mind who's been through the indoctrination system. And it just goes on and on like that. I mean, I think if we were to try to do a serious comparison, we would find that the degree to which minds are distorted and controlled under free societies easily compares with, and maybe considerably worse with, than the product in systems where propaganda is overt, clear, supported by the bludgeon, and so on. Well, I can go on with this kind of stuff indefinitely, but it seems to me that's basically the story. After that, it's a matter of filling in the details and seeing how it in fact works in case after case. Yeah.
In the labor movement, all they talk about degradation, that kind of work being degrading. Was that coming mostly from European immigrants in the United States?
From what they called the Lowell Mill Girls, meaning young women who came off the farms to a good deal of the labor organizing in the 19th century was women, of course, because just like today in the Third World, it's assumed that the most docile and controllable workforce is women. You can really control. So the early industrial revolution's textiles, and it's around here. It's Lowell and Lawrence and places like that. That's where the industrial revolution took off. Very extensively women. In fact, some of the main labor journals were edited by women, and they're young women mostly who were, people who wanted to do things like they wanted to read, they wanted to learn, they wanted to study, and so on and so forth. That was considered normal. And here they wanted to have free lives. In fact, many of them didn't work there very long. They'd work for a couple of years and then go back to some other life. Both in the early stages, it was the Lowell Mill Girl types and farmers, who were being driven off the farms. They complained about the degradation of life. When the immigrants came, the story changed. The big wave of immigration in the United States was around the middle of the 19th century. In fact, the percentage of the population that was immigrant at that time was higher than it's ever been since. The numbers got bigger in the 19th century, but as a proportion of the population, it was biggest, I think, around 1850 or something roughly there. The immigrants were coming from extremely impoverished parts of Europe. So, for example, Ireland, say. Ireland was being devastated. What was going on. That was the time of the Irish famine, when millions of, Ireland was depopulated. Ireland's the oldest colony in the world, and it's one of the few parts of the world that was literally not only underdeveloped, like most colonies, but depopulated. Ireland now has about half the population it had in the early 19th century. It was originally a rich place like England. But in fact, Ireland's been a colony for like 800 years and so on, so it's got a big history. But in the 1840s, when the Irish famine took place, and that was like an economist's famine. So, for example, Ireland was exporting food during the famine because the sacred principles of political economy said that that's the way it's supposed to work. And the Irish who came to the United States were just treated like dogs. Miserably treated. And Irish women were used for experimentation in Mengele-style experiments, for example. Literally, that's not a joke. Irish workers were forced to work for essentially nothing or were willing to do it because they had no choice. And the same is true of people who were coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, and that undercut the domestic workforce. The Lowell Mill girls could not or would not work at the level of immigrants who came in. That, in fact, undercut the early labor movement to a significant extent. It took a long time before you started getting, the growth of labor organizing and so on from these sources. So it wasn't a European input. In fact, quite the opposite. These were just natural reactions. You didn't have to have any training. You didn't have to read Marx or anything like that. It's just degrading to have to follow orders. And it's to be stuck in a place where you slave 12 hours a day and then you go into a dormitory where they watch your morals and so on, which is what these things were like, that people simply regarded as degrading. Same with individual, like a shoemaker or something. They wanted to be able to run their own lives. Shoemakers would, let's say, hire people to read to them while they were working. These were people who had, libraries like everybody else. They wanted to live lives, and they wanted to control their work themselves. And they were being forced into shoe manufacturing plants in Lowell, where they were treated like, not even like animals, like machines. And that was degrading and demeaning, and they fought against it and so on. And it took a long time, very long time, to make people understand that that these are the only alternatives. So you forget about it. You say, okay, I'm degraded.
I'm wondering, back to the indoctrination system that eliminates the possibility of asking the fundamental questions. How did you survive that indoctrination system?
Well, you could any of us could ask the same question. The people do get through somehow, and they do it in their own crazy ways. I could, probably I'm not the best judge of how I did it, but I can tell you what I think. I don't know why it's of any interest to anyone. Anybody else's story is just as interesting. We're all here because we got through it somehow, And everybody has their own story as to how they did it. I had my story, you had your story. Not that I'm reticent about talking about it. I just don't see why anybody cares. It's my personal history, which nobody else lived through. But I grew up in the Depression, so my earliest childhood memories are people coming to the door selling rags and apples and things, and taking a trolley car with my mother and seeing police attack women pickets outside the Philadelphia factories and beat them up and stuff like that. Plus the fact that those are childhood memories, they're searing memories. Plus the fact that a good part of my family was Jewish working class, and very much from this kind of background. It was, they were politically very active, intellectually very much alive, often without much in the way of education. In fact, one uncle who had probably more influence on me than anybody else never went past 4th grade. But he was a very, very lively mind, understood all kind of things. They lived in a very rich cultural world, and also one of plenty of political activism. So, growing up in that has its effect. Other people have had their own stories. And hold off for 1 second. There's another factor which may be relevant, so let me mention it. And that is, it just happened that I went to what would these days be called a free school. So from about both my parents were working, so I was in school from about 18 months old. And from 18 months old till about 12, I guess, I was in a Deweyite experimental school, which was a very exciting atmosphere. I remember things from 3rd grade very well. I can't remember anything from high school. I went from there into the city academic high school for smart kids whose parents wanted to go to college. That school, every city has one of those things. And I went to that one, and that's just like a black hole. I can't remember one thing that happened there. It was total. But I can tell you what I wrote in my third grade compositions. That was just an exciting atmosphere, and that probably had an effect, which may teach something.
Anyway, talking about the way that some types of economic thought got instituted as sort of legitimate in terms of departments of economics, where a bunch of people, social Darwinists, people like Malthus, who in various ways blamed the poor for being poor. I was wondering how those sorts of views got instituted over the past few centuries with respect to the development of universities.
Well, Malthus gets a kind of a bad press. He's known for what you said, but he was in fact he was one of the founders of classical economics, right alongside of people like Ricardo. In fact, what I was quoting before was from Malthus. His line was that if you do not have independent, here's like virtually a quote, if you don't have independent wealth and you cannot sell your labor on the labor market at a level at which you can survive, then you have no right being here. Go somewhere else. It's not your fault. I'm not saying it's the fault of anybody. He said this is a law of nature. In fact, Ricardo said this is true at the level of the principles of gravitation. Just a law of nature. It's a law of nature, and to try to interfere with the law of nature, of course, only makes things worse. So both Malthus and Ricardo argued, sort of parallel, that you harm people, you harm the poor by letting them believe that they have a right to live. And they worked it all out, in the way you sort of learn in when you study economics. So you know the story. It interferes with the market and with efficiency and with growth and so on. So ultimately, they're worse off if you make them think they have rights other than the rights on the market, like a right to live. And that was serious economics. That's what people teach right now. I mean, I don't think it's that different. Like you have more mathematical formulas and stuff, but it's basically the same story. How did they get instituted? As a weapon of class warfare. There was a big battle in the early 19th century in England in which these people became, actually the history of it is kind of intriguing. There's only one book that I know about it, if you're interested in looking it up. It's by a good economic historian. His name is Rajani Kanth, K-A-N-T-H. He was just rewarded for his efforts by being thrown out of the University of Utah. As far as I know, this is the only book on the subject. He goes through all this classical stuff, and it's very revealing. This is actually originally a doctoral dissertation with Robert Heilbrunner, kind of a social democratic economic historian in New York. What happened is that as you had the rising bourgeoisie, the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. In England, of course, there were two main impediments to them. One was what were called the Poor Laws, and the other was called the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws sort of gave landlords certain rights beyond what they could get on the market, like it raised the price of corn, that sort of thing. The Poor Laws are what we call welfare. They sort of kept people alive if they couldn't. This is after a period when a large part of the population had been forcefully driven off the land. By force. It wasn't a pretty picture. In fact, probably very likely one of the main reasons why England led the Industrial Revolution was they had been much more violent in driving people off the land, whereas in France, a lot of people stayed on the land and therefore resisted the industrialization more. But after you drove the people off the land, there was a period when their right to live was preserved by what we would call welfare, the Poor Laws. And that interfered with the rise of capitalism, just as the Corn Laws did, and plus the subsidies on food and so on. So you had to have what happened in the early 19th century is, first there was the industrialization was taking place, it was developing, but you needed an ideology behind it. Essentially to knock out of people's heads the idea that they have a right to live. That's what it was about. They don't have a right to live. It had to be driven out of their heads, and classical economics developed the theory of that with the certainty of the principles of gravitation. And by the 1830s, the political system was changed enough so that the rising bourgeoisie essentially took over the political system, and they were able to kill the Poor Laws and later on the Corn Laws, and they'd won. And at that point, they essentially gave up the theory. And political economy changed. It changed for a lot of reasons. One thing, they'd won, so they didn't need it any longer. For another reason, they recognized that they themselves needed a powerful interventionist state, as they always had, in fact, because there's no way for capitalism to survive except with powerful state intervention to protect the rich from market discipline, which would destroy them. So you needed a powerful state, as they always had. And the third thing was that elimination of the right to live had an effect. Namely, the first effect was that it started causing riots all over the place. For a long period, the British Army was mostly involved in putting down riots. And then something even worse happened. People started to organize. So you got the beginnings of an organized labor movement, and later the Chartist movement and socialist movement and so on. At that point, it was recognized, this stuff the game better be called off. And by the time you get to the middle of the century, people like John Stuart Mill, if you read, say, Mill's, that's the classic work, Mill's Principles of Political Economy or whatever it is, that's kind of social democratic. The science happens to be a very flexible one. You can change it to do whatever you feel like. It's that kind of science. So the science changed, and it turned out that laissez-faire was a bad thing, after all. And in fact, for about a century, it was a bad word. Nobody ever talked about it. Came back again in the 1970s. And what you had is the foundations of a welfare state. The science now said that you better give people a way of living, or else they're going to challenge the right to rule. You can take away their right to live, but then they're going to take away your right to rule, and that won't work. So therefore, ways have to be found to accommodate them. Besides, we need the powerful state anyway, and besides, we've won, so we can stop the game. That's more or less what happened by the middle of the 19th century in England, a little later here. And then the new political economy works its way into, the universities and so on and so forth. And still today, the way it happened historically is kind of so I'll explain. A lot of, if you look at, the people around here can tell you a lot more about, you got some, people who know economics around here can talk to you about it in more detail. But what basically happens, as far as I can see, is that the principles of classical economy are in effect still taught. I don't think what's taught now is all that different, what's called neoliberalism. But it's been revived in recent years, again, as a weapon of class warfare. It doesn't maybe has less validity than it had then. At least in the early 19th century, say, when you read, say, Ricardo and Malthus, their assumptions had some relation to reality. Now the assumptions don't even have any relation to reality. Like what their basic assumptions were that, and this is crucial to proving all the nice theorems, that capital is relatively immobile and labor is highly mobile. That's required. So that's why they could say, if you don't get enough on the labor market, go somewhere else, because you could go somewhere else. Not because of the market. After the native population in the United States and Australia and Tasmania had been exterminated, by state, not by the market. They weren't exterminated by the market, by bullets and things like that. After they were exterminated or driven away, then you could go somewhere else. So labor was highly mobile. That was true. Labor was indeed mobile. Capital, indeed, was relatively immobile. For one thing, because capital meant mostly land, and you can't move it. And to the extent that there was any investment, it was very local. You didn't have the communication systems or anything else to make investment anything more than close by. So the assumption that capital is immobile and labor is mobile was more or less realistic. And on the basis of that, you can prove things about comparative advantage. The stuff you learn in school about Portugal and wine and, all that kind of business. Incidentally, if you want to know how well these theorems worked, just have a look at Portugal and England after a year of trying out, 100 years of trying out those experiments, and you see exactly how comparative advantage worked. But let's put that aside. By now, the assumptions are not only false, but they're the opposite of the truth. By now, labor is immobile through immigration restrictions, and capital is highly mobile. So, in fact, none of the results work anymore. But you still taught them. You're still taught them exactly as before, even though the assumptions have not only, they're now the opposite of what was assumed at that time. Now, if you really look at the fancy economists, Paul Krugman and so on, there's all kind of little tricks here and there to make it not so grotesquely ridiculous as this would be. But fundamentally, it is just pretty ridiculous, If capital's mobile and labor's immobile, there's no reason why capital shouldn't seek absolute advantage, in which case you're not going to have any principles of comparative advantage. And if labor's immobile, that simply means that mobile capital can play one national workforce against another. And that's what all these trade agreements are about, and drive everybody down. I mean, nothing works. Doesn't matter how many footnotes you put in or how many little ways you tinker around the edges. The whole thing is just totally rotten at the core. It has no relation to reality even anymore. And furthermore, it never did. The fact of the matter is that another one of those things you're not allowed to think, although any economist's got to know it, is that there isn't one case on record of not in history of any country that's developed through free market principles. Nothing. I mean, certainly not the United States. The United States always had extensive state intervention, and we would have no economy otherwise. I mean, we would be exporting fur now if we were following the principles of comparative advantage. It's because the reason why the Industrial Revolution took off in Lowell and Lawrence is because of high protective tariffs that were keeping out British goods, and it runs right up till today. We wouldn't have high-tech industry today if it wasn't for a huge public subsidy. In fact, read today's New York Times. This morning, I just read it before I came in. There's a story there on the business page about how there's a funny recovery. There's a lot of economic growth, but no jobs. Big surprise. And it talks about how well it's about one factory, the Whirlpool factory, which is setting up a factory in Tulsa. The last paragraph points out how the free market really works. The reason why Whirlpool put the factory in Tulsa rather than in, say, Mexico is that the taxpayers in Tulsa are paying 25% of the capital costs. Okay, that's the free market, And that's, in fact, the way it's always worked. I mean, as long as the public's willing to pay the costs, private power is perfectly willing to take the profits. And that's the way the free market works. From the early days of the Industrial Revolution up till this morning, without any known exception. In fact, the most dramatic example of this, which I suspect you guys tell me is never even taught in economics courses, is the Industrial Revolution was fueled by textiles, meaning one commodity, cotton, and cotton was cheap. That was crucially important. Why was cotton cheap? Because market forces drove it down? No. No, look, cotton was cheap because you exterminated the native population and you brought in slaves. I mean, try to imagine a more severe market distortion than that. Genocide and slavery. That's why cotton was cheap. Other countries which had their own cotton tried to get started on an industrial revolution, but they didn't get very far because England had more guns. Like Egypt, which had its own cotton, started an industrial revolution about the same time the United States did, around 1820, like around then. But the British were not going to tolerate a competitor in the Eastern Mediterranean, so they just stopped it by force. Okay, no industrial revolution in Egypt. There is one in the United States because they couldn't stop this one by force, and it just goes on like that. I mean, the U.S. took Texas. You read the Jacksonian Democrats like Polk and Tyler and those guys. Why did they want Texas so badly? Well, partly they were afraid that Texas might become a free state, so it would harm slavery. But another reason, and a major reason, was because they wanted to make sure that they had a monopoly of cotton. It was assumed at that time that southeastern United States was the main source of cotton. And remember, cotton is like the oil of the 19th century. It's what really fuels the whole thing. And they figured if they took Texas, which was another cotton-producing area, they could strangle England. And remember, England was the main enemy at that time. England had was much more powerful militarily. That's why the United States was never able to conquer Canada the way they wanted to, and was never able to take Cuba because the British Navy was in the way, and so on. So England was the real enemy. They hated England. If you read these guys, Polk and Tyler, and they said if we can get Texas, we can bring England to our feet, and then we can gain mastery of the trade of the world. Not through the free market. In fact, these are the worst charges paranoid charges that were made against Saddam Hussein apply exactly to the Jacksonian Democrats. That they wanted to monopolize the main fuel of the world so that they could bring everybody to our feet. Nothing to do with the market. I don't know if they teach this stuff in economics courses, but I'd be surprised. But I mean, and again, these are not complicated things. Everybody knows why cotton was cheap, right? Everybody who went to elementary school knows why cotton was cheap. And if it hadn't been for cheap cotton, there wouldn't have been an industrial revolution. Incidentally, the same lessons apply today. Today it's oil. Why is oil cheap? Well, that's what you pay your taxes for. I mean, a large part of the Pentagon system is there to make sure that oil prices stay within a certain range, not too low because the Western economies and energy corporations depend on the profits, but not too high because that might interfere with what is called the efficiency of trade. Well, the efficiency of trade is efficient in part because a lot of force is used to keep the price from going too high, but that has nothing to do with the market. And that's a big, if you want to measure the cost of trade, you'd have to bring in things like the cost of the Pentagon, for one. It's not all. In fact, these so-called market distortions are not footnotes. These are huge phenomena. Nobody ever tries to estimate them, But if anybody tried to calculate these things, the efficiency of trade would drop very, very low, and it would be, in fact, extremely inefficient. And maybe economists aren't supposed to talk about this, but people in the business world know it perfectly well, which is why they've always called upon a powerful state to protect them from market discipline. They don't want market discipline any more than they want, democratic control, and they have always blocked it. And that's true of just about every aspect of any developed economy that you look at. Take the other, right now it's standardly claimed these days that the reason why everybody's suffering, like there's no work and there's no jobs and wages go down and so on, is due to, like Ricardo said, laws with like the principle of gravitation, kind of laws of nature. The efficiency of trade and automation. Well, the efficiency of trade is mostly a fraud for all sorts of reasons, of which I just mentioned one. What about automation? There's an interesting story, and in fact there's very good work on it by David Noble, who used to be at MIT but was thrown out in part because of this work, who wrote a book called Forces of Production, and more recently has a kind of that's a technical book, but it's kind of like a popular book which gives the main point. It's called Production Without Profits, I think. But he's the only guy I know who's studied automation very carefully in close detail. And now it is true that automation is efficient. So like by market principles, automation, saves you money and drives workers out. But it didn't get that way because of market principles. It got that way through the state sector. It was, for 30 years, automation was developed through the military system. And the reason is it was so inefficient that it could never have survived in the market. So therefore it was done the way we do everything, through the state sector. And in the Army, in the Air Force and the Navy, where it was mostly developed, nobody cares about costs because the public's paying anyhow. So you have any costs you like. And through this, in these ways, they were able to develop automation to the point where it can be used to drive people out of work. But that's not market forces. Furthermore, if you look closely, we get back to what the 19th century workers were complaining about. Automation could have been designed in such a way as to use the skills of skilled machinists and to eliminate management. There's nothing in automation that says it can't be used that way. But it wasn't, believe me. It was used exactly the other way. It was designed through the state system to demean and degrade people. That is, to de-skill workers and increase management control. And again, that had nothing to do with the market and had nothing to do with the nature of the technology. It had to do with power interests. Now, if economics was like a real field, these would be the things they would study. Because, it's true that there are some market things around the edges somewhere, but these are major things that, these are major factors. When you talk about automation and trade as causing the sort of third worldization of the world, it's sort of true if you take a narrow enough perspective. But if you look into the factors that made it that way, it doesn't even come close to being true. Well, to get back to your point, why isn't there in a way, these things are taught in universities. Okay, like for example, I guess if you take a course in the mechanical engineering department at MIT, they'll probably tell you something about maybe they'll tell you something about the history of automation. If you take an economics course, they'll tell you something about the free market. If you take a political science course, they'll tell you something about, the way things work in the government and so on. But nobody's going to tell you what's going on in the world, which involves all of these things critically. There is no such field. There's no field that deals with what's actually happening in the world. And that's extremely important that there be no such field, because if there were such a field, people might understand it. And notice that and in fact, you don't have to have it at MIT. You could have it in junior high school, because this stuff is all pretty straightforward. There's nothing that I've just said that you couldn't explain to junior high school students. Like it's not quantum physics or something. It's pretty elementary, the basic things. But there better not be such a field, or else people might understand too much, and in a relatively free society, they might do something with their understanding. So that's how the universities get the way they are. Even the specialization of disciplines has the effect of making it impossible to understand. You're in the economics department, you study, a generalization to 10-dimensional space of some non-existent free market economy. You study that, And if you're in the political science department, you study micro bureaucracy, like the way one bureaucrat talks to another bureaucrat and some detail there. And in the mechanical engineering department, they probably teach you something about automation, I suppose. But it's only to the public that, you get the message that all of this stuff is inexorable forces of nature that are sort of driving us in this direction, and you just harm people if you interfere with them. Not only is it not true now, it's never been true in history. But again, those are thoughts you're not supposed to think. Think those thoughts, you're out.
Do you believe that welfare in America is a direct subsidization of poverty?
No, it's a subsidization of the rich. Most welfare goes to the rich, remember. Welfare, by and large, goes to the rich. If by welfare we mean, welfare comes in several different varieties. A large part, suppose that you're let's say you have a mother with 6 kids and no job, and she gets, say, a $100 check. Okay, so that's one kind of welfare. Suppose you're me, let's say, rich, somebody's rich, and I have a home mortgage, and I get $100 of tax relief because of my home mortgage. It's the same government payment. It's just one of them is hidden in regressive fiscal measures, and the other is a direct sum of money, but it's exactly the same thing. It would have come out the same if they gave me the $100 and took away $100 from her taxes. It would come out exactly the same. Well, if you take a look at the welfare that's given to the rich by regressive fiscal measures, it's huge. In fact, of things like, say, home mortgages, about 80% of that welfare goes to people with incomes over $50,000 a year. And of course, it goes up higher as you get richer. Like if you have $1 million home, you're getting a much bigger piece than if you have a $200,000 home. So that's, and if you look at, say, business expenditures, business expenses, which you can take off your income tax, it's huge things. It all goes to the rich. Or take, say, charitable contributions. Well, almost all of it goes to the rich again. That's ways of cutting down your taxes, which means it's a subsidy. It's exactly like a welfare payment. Sometimes this is called the hidden welfare state. And it's hidden because it's all concealed in regressive fiscal measures. It's not like money that you actually hand over to someone, but it comes out the same. Now, that doesn't even count the big parts. The big parts are the straight subsidies. So if you take, say, subsidies to agribusiness, tens of billions of dollars a year, of public money just goes to agribusiness. Or take, say, the Pentagon. What's the Pentagon? That's hundreds of billions of dollars. Most of it's just subsidy to the wealthy. It's money that goes into keeping big corporations going. As I was driving in this morning, I was listening to PBS, torture on the radio news, and they were interviewing it was about drug prices. And it's a big business now. There's a lot of concern now that some health reform might cut down drug profits. So there's a big propaganda campaign going on, which of course PBS is right in the middle of, to try to tell you why this would be a terrible thing to do. So they were interviewing some Merck executive or something, and they were taking some reporter through the Merck plant, and showing them how all these people are working really hard to invent drugs, and it's very expensive and so on and so forth. They didn't mention what drug profits are like, which is about twice as high as any other part of the corporate system. And they didn't mention the amount of drug profits that are used for advertising, which is huge, to try to force doctors to do things that make no sense. And they also didn't mention the fact that an awful lot of the biological research from which the drug companies rip things off is done in places like this, in public facilities. I mean, biology departments in universities, for example, whatever they produce goes right off to the drug companies, the fundamental biology, and sometimes even the applied biology. Incidentally, they didn't mention another thing which nobody ever mentions except in the third world, and that is that an awful lot of the research for the drug companies has been done by indigenous peoples for thousands of years, in fact. And for thousands of years, people have been doing breeding of animals and plants and learning about herbs and so on and so forth. And the drug companies understand that there's an awful lot of knowledge there. And they're just ripping it off. They don't pay anybody. They go down and rip off thousands of years of labor. You don't get patent rights for it. And then you make some slight, genetic change in it, and you sell it back to these people at 50,000 times the cost and so on. Well, these are all market interferences. These are the way things really work. This is the welfare state. You go back to the welfare state, this is the welfare state. Yeah, it's like a pea on a mountain, for driving it down. The existence of the programs, well, it's because people fought for it. I mean, most of this is a residue of 1930. It's, the kind of reforms that came along in worker struggles and popular struggles and so on and so forth. It wasn't given as a gift. So yeah, and to some extent, business is even in favor of it, for the same reasons that they were in favor of, that the classical political economy collapsed and turned into sort of social democratic political economy. If you don't give people something, they may get out of control. And in fact, they may challenge the right to rule, which is bad. So there's got to be enough there to keep people quiet. Plus the fact that it's just victories. These are victories, after all. And victories came after a lot of struggle. Take a look, say, at the right. A lot of this is just a result of the existence of the labor movement. Quite a lot, in fact. And that's a very long, difficult, and violent history. In the first half of this century, hundreds of workers were simply killed by security forces just trying to organize. The United States has an unusually violent labor history. I mean, so violent, in fact, that if you read the right-wing British press, like the London Times, say the 1920s, they couldn't understand the brutality of the treatment of American workers and their lack of rights. This went right in. This is a business-run society. It wasn't until the 1930s, after years of very hard struggle, that American workers got basic rights, including some of these rights, which just spread over into the welfare system and were picked up again. But it's a combination of just popular struggle and willingness to accede to it in order to keep people quiet. And that's where you get the pea on the mountain. But don't forget the mountain. Like they're talking about welfare reform now, but they're only talking about the pea. They're not talking about putting executives to work. They get paid. They just get paid welfare. It's poor mothers who are supposed to go to work. And again, that's one of the things you're not supposed to think. You think that, you're out of the system.
I've got two questions, and they're sort of obscurely related. You have, in my watching your reactions to the film about you, you've shown a lot of discomfort.
You should see the letters I write him.
You said in the first seminar where I talked to you today, you talked to our group, again you said something critical about it. And I just wonder, I'm sure that you realize the political potency that the film is having. And I was thinking to myself, if this was a film about Bertrand Russell and his powerful ideas and how he helped to shape society with his ideas, would you be as critical? Or would you see it as a powerful organizing tool?
Both.
To get that out?
Both.
So basically my first thing is, I'd love to hear you say something positive about the film. That would make me feel better.
Well, what I would say is exactly what you said. I mean, the positive impact of it has been astonishing to me. And I can see it, because outside the United States, Mark can give you the details, but outside the United States, it's shown all over the place. I mean, even inside the United States, it's shown to some extent. But everywhere else, it's on national television.
I mean, it came to Seattle 4 times.
Okay, but, almost everywhere else it's on national television. I didn't realize this myself until I was traveling around Europe last year, and you go to Finland, oh yeah, everybody saw it on television, you know, that sort of thing. And I'm invited to film festivals all over the world, you know, literally, you know. And, you know, by now they've, okay, and so, but anyway, the result of that is there's a ton of reviewing. The reviewing is extremely interesting. I mean, if you read I guess you've read the reviews, but they're quite fascinating. The reviews are often written just by, you know, guys who write TV criticism for the newspapers, you know, completely apolitical people. So you get kind of an interesting reaction, you know, and the reaction is extremely positive. And I'd say like 98% of it is very positive. In fact, about the only thing that got a lot of people pissed off, including Phil Donahue, are some remarks I made about sports there. People got kind of angry about that. But most of it is very positive. They say, yeah, really interesting. And furthermore, I get a ton of letters, you know. Like I get a letter from some steel worker in Canada saying, you know, yeah, I took my friends 3 times and we all saw it and I think it's great and so on and so forth. But the standard letter is something like this. It says, you know, I'm really glad they made this film. I thought I was the only person in the world who had these thoughts. I'm delighted to know that somebody actually has it and saying it. Then comes the punchline. How can I join your movement? You know? Okay, that's why I'm ambivalent. Now, see, I don't think it's anything that they did that's wrong. I mean, I'm sure that I know that they were very well aware of this and tried very hard to overcome it, but it's somehow inherent in the medium. You know, I don't think the medium allows an escape from this. Or if it does, I don't think it has yet found it, to make people understand that if I'm giving a talk, you know, if they film me giving a talk somewhere, that's because somebody organized the talk. And the real work is being done by the people who organized the talk and follow it up and so on and so forth. And if they can bring somebody in to bring people together, terrific. You know. But that somehow doesn't get across. So what gets across is, how can I join your movement? You know? And then I got to write a letter, which is a speech about this. So I am ambivalent about it. Incidentally, let me just last comment on the reviews. The reviews in the United States are intriguingly different. First of all, there aren't many because it wasn't shown a lot, but they're very interesting. So the most interesting one, you remember the New York Times review? That was fascinating. Well, yeah, but yeah, right. Also, but the review, actually, the Times, to my surprise, wrote a very favorable review, or what they took to be a very favorable review. They gave the review to Vincent Canby, who's a kind of an old-time New Dealer. You know, he's their main culture. I think he's probably retired by now, but he was like an old New Dealer who's been the big cultural critic of the Times forever. And he wrote a review which was, you know, I'm sure everybody who read it took it to be very favorable. It was, oh yeah, really interesting guy, wonderful film, so on and so forth. Didn't you think so? I thought it was. He said also, of course, there's nothing to it. You know, he said, well, of course, it's all nonsense. But it was very, you know, very sympathetic. And then he said, though it's all nonsense, nevertheless, he said the leading idea of it is worth taking seriously, even though it sounds crazy. So, and the leading idea, he said, was that the government is only responsive to the 50% of the population who vote, not to the 50% who don't vote. So therefore, we ought to try to register more people. He says, well, this sounds kind of, you know, pretty far out in left field, but nevertheless, we shouldn't discount it totally. You know, something like that. You know, well, I mean, it just like flew by him completely. We didn't see what the film was about. I mean, you know, the most illiterate TV reviewer in, you know, Tasmania or something didn't miss the point like that. It's only here that it has to be completely missed, and that's what it means to think properly, you know. But as about the film, I think it's double-edged. You know, it certainly energized a lot. I think it did a tremendous amount of good just for East Timor alone. And it's had a good impact in other respects, but it has this negative aspect, which seems to be unavoidable. You wanted to say something, Mark?
Yeah, well, I'm sure you're aware that we have you saying in the film almost verbatim what you just said.
Yeah, I know, but it doesn't get across. That's right. But there's something about the medium which prevents it from getting across. I know that it was tried. I know that that was the idea, but, you know, how do you...
Is it really the majority of letters that all say, I want to join you?
Well, they say something like that. I mean, the general picture is it's about me, you know. And it isn't. You know, the whole point is it's not, you know. And how do you get that across to people, you know?
Well, it is about you, and the ideas aren't about you. The ideas are for the...
But see, it really isn't, because if I'm there, it's precisely because somebody organized a meeting. Like, I'm here, but I didn't do anything. Mike and Lydia did something. I didn't do anything. And that's the way it is everywhere else. Now, to get...
You're also here because of the way you grew up, and that school that you went to.
But same's true of everybody else who's here, too.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Same with everybody else. Yeah, but that's because you're doing important things and I'm not doing important things. That's what it actually comes. I mean, I used to, back in, years ago, I used to be involved in organizing too, and I'd go to meetings and get involved in resistance and go to jail and all that stuff. And I wasn't organizing. I was just no good at it all. I mean, some of these people here can tell you. And finally, there turned out to be sort of like a division of labor. So some friends of mine who were, same as me, went to the same colleges and the same graduate school and the same prizes and everything else, and teach at MIT and so on, just went a different way. They spend their time organizing, which is much more important work. And so they're not in the film, right? I mean, I do something basically less important. It is, in fact. It's like adding something, and I can do it, so I do it. I don't have any false modesty or anything. And it's helpful, but it's helpful to people who are doing the real work. And actually, every popular movement in history has been like that. Take, say, one in our recent history, say the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, you ask people what was the Civil Rights, name somebody associated with the Civil Rights Movement, 99 people out of 100, if not 100 out of 100, will say Martin Luther King, who was a person of considerable importance, but one of the least important people in the Civil Rights Movement. The really important people in the Civil Rights Movement were people like SNCC workers in the South. Guys were out there week after week, day after day, getting beaten up and killed and marginalized and so on. They're the ones who set up a situation in which Martin Luther King could come to town and draw the media. I'm sure he would have said the same thing, or at least he should have. And I think any authentic popular movement has always been like that. And it's extremely important not to let people understand that. It's extremely important not to let people understand, to make them think that there are big leaders around there who somehow get things going, and what you do is follow them. That's, again, another way of demeaning people and degrading them and making them passive and so on. I don't know how to overcome this exactly. But it's something that people ought to work on.
So I had a related question, and you'll see how it's connected. Is you're an anarchist, and I'm wondering whether you could tell us, a moment or two in your life that catalyzed for you
the anarchism.
Yeah, your anarchism.
It goes back as far as I can remember, so I just can't say. I mean, that the first time I had political thoughts in my head, that's what they were. When I was about 10 or 11 years old, I was, as soon as I got old enough to take the train, but I lived in Philadelphia, which in those days there were things like trains, so you could go to New York as easily as you could get downtown. As soon as I was old enough to go to New York, like 11 or 12, I'd go down and hang around Union Square and go to the anarchist bookstores. And there were millions of left bookstores all the way down 4th Avenue in those days. They're all gone, of course. And they were usually very lively places, owned by some individual who was usually an interesting person. Some young kid would come around, sit around and talk to him for hours, and they had interesting histories and stuff. Or I'd just go to things like the anarchist offices around there and pick up pamphlets and stuff. And that's about as far back as I can remember. In fact, I don't exactly know why, but I was extremely skeptical about everything that was going on. During the Second World War, I would spend a lot of time going down to the Philadelphia Public Library, reading. They had their collections of all the very obscure publications of all the marginal left sects, including things that I was really fascinated by. I didn't really believe them, but I kind of read them with a lot of interest. And in retrospect, they weren't totally false. But there was a little left sect called the Marlonites, which consisted of a guy named Marlon, as you can imagine, is Marx, Lenin, but the guy's name was actually George Spiro, and I think the sect consisted of him and his wife, I later discovered, maybe their cousin or something. But they published something called, I forget what, and their theory, which was quite sophisticated and worked out and was pretty impressive, I'd like to go back and read it again now and see what I think about it, was that the whole thing was a phony war, that the war was put together by the ruling classes of the Soviet Union. They're very anti-Stalinist. The Soviet Union, and the West, and the fascists, And it was done in order to decimate the European working classes, so that then, you know, basically some kind of fascist power would take over everything, which is not very far from what happened, I should say. So that was their picture of the war, and, you know, this was while it was going on, so everybody's in the midst of jingoist hysteria. But that's what I was reading. I don't know why. I mean, I never believed I mean, we had a prison camp right next door to my high school. It was right next door, literally. Like, so there was a fence, you know, with barbed wire, and on the other side were prisoners of war. And the students in the high school were always taunting them and, you know, throwing things at them. There were a couple of us, I'd say maybe a handful of kids who were very opposed, the political ones, you know, little nucleus, who were really opposed to this and tried to talk to other students and tell them, look, those guys are victims, I mean, just like anybody else. It existed. I mean, you know, I don't know where it comes from. I mean, I'm sure, like I say, I'm sure anybody here can tell the same story in their own history.
Can I ask what you do with those letters from steel workers?
What I do with them?
If you do, I think you do. I have a suggestion.
Oh, they're somewhere in file somewhere.
I have a suggestion. Have your department secretary or whoever your assistant is.
There isn't anybody. There isn't anybody.
Just bundle them up yourself.
Yeah.
Take them over in Cambridge to the University Conversion Project office and let us sort them. And then we'll send those people appropriate replies.
Oh, I write back to them. I write back to them. I write back to everybody, yeah. Yeah, I never, I mean, unless it's really out of this world, I write back. So yeah, they've gotten letters. Some of them I didn't really, I can't save, it's just too much. But I mean, I send out about 100 letters a week probably. And some of them, a lot of them get saved. But, you know, to try to find them would be a colossal task.
I wanted to comment on what you were saying about the movie, and I guess I feel the same way, because when I came, well, actually, I read several of your books before I saw the film. And, you know, I'm used to reading books by people who are no longer alive, so. Honest to God, I used to think that if you were going to be a dissident, you had to be either Russian or dead, preferably both.
Well, I got a Russian name.
Yeah.
A lot of people wish I were dead.
But one of the things that, for example, when I read your essay, Responsibilities of Intellectuals, and you mentioned reading Dwight McDonald's essay, I had read that same essay late in college because I found one of his collections in a library sale. It was 50 cents. So.
Yeah.
But it was, you know, you feel when you read somebody in a book, at least I almost feel like I'm in a position of apprenticeship, like I want to find out how this person does what they do, and it's like, you know, I look at everybody that I read is a teacher. But when I saw the movie, my perception changed, and I was like, well, yeah, I know he's just a person, and he puts on his socks one at a time, just like the rest of us. But there's something about watching somebody's face on the screen for 3 hours that it's different from reading their books. And when I came here, frankly, I could tell which people had read your books and which people had seen the movie, because there's kind of like, you know, this guy's a movie star. I was like, I would be embarrassed. I mean, I would be mortally embarrassed. So
Yeah. I know what it's like. I mean, it depends on like in a place like San Francisco, it is embarrassing. Like, I can't walk across the Berkeley campus, you know, literally, without 20 people coming up and asking me to sign something. And, you know, that's, you know, it's just doesn't make any sense, you know. I mean,
well, I felt odd having you sign
yeah,
up
it's
for my
crazy.
friend, but it's because when you talk about the other person in our collective come here. She's got 6 kids, so
Yeah.
it's kind of an impediment. So the thing is that, you know, it feels unnatural.
It is.
You don't, you know.
It's completely wrong. You know, it's completely missing the point. You know, it's simply not factually accurate, for one thing, because, as I said, the real work is being done by people who are not known. That's always true. The people who are known are riding the crest of some wave. Now, you know, you can ride the crest of a wave and just try to use it to get power, which is the standard thing. Or you can ride the crest of the wave because you're helping people that way, which is another thing. But the point is, it's really the wave that matters. And that's what people ought to understand, and I don't know how you get that across in a film. Actually, there are some films which do it. You know, if you look at films like, say, Salt of the Earth or something like that, they do it somehow. But those are rare and hard to make. Yeah.
I just wanted to say one thing about the film, and that is in Canada, I'm an actress for East Timor. They put our level of work on a completely different level. And so maybe you feel like that's not it or whatever, but it's got people doing the real work now.
Yeah, I think I know that's true.
But one question I had to ask you, aside from that, was when I come down here to the States and I turn on the television, I mean, I can see the States television in Canada, but I can watch television in Canada because I'm busy from there. So I'm here and I turn on the television, and to me, it's so blatant. It's just, I mean, I see this woman talking about guilt from abortion, and there's this black woman saying I'm on welfare because I'm lazy, and then it's just one image after another.
Yeah.
And it's so, there's no subtlety whatsoever. And in Canada, it's subtle. And you've got a group of people, or a good percentage of people who read the Globe and Mail, and which, you know, may not be so subtle to somebody like us here, but is subtle. It's not as obvious. And who watch CBC. And on CBC, they wouldn't put the black woman saying, I'm lazy, I'm on welfare because I'm lazy. They'll put up a graph with the, you know, twisted dates and make it look like it's all, everybody's ripping off the welfare system, right? And it has the same effect, but it's more subtle. And I was just wondering if you could tell me, because I know you studied Canadian media, but what you feel about that difference and the impact, especially the implications for activism about issues like East Timor in Canada as opposed to the United States.
Well, I mean, Canada, the differences between Canada and the United States are very interesting and worth studying, actually, because, you know, here's two countries which ought to be exactly alike. I mean, they're in the same place, you know, they have basically the same economic system, they're owned by the same people, you know, and they're very different. And the reasons for those differences are worth trying to bring out. And, you know, I don't think I know enough to try to say what they are, but you can make some guesses. However, they are definitely different. There's no question.
I could not apply the propaganda model.
Yeah, you could. You could. Yeah, you could. No, I think you're wrong about that. Let me give you some examples. I haven't studied in great depth, but somewhat. The book, not Manufacturing Consent, but the one I did right before, I guess after that, Necessary Illusions, was talks over CBC on the media. Okay. And they had invited me to give talks over CBC on the media. Okay, that would never happen here, obviously, so that's a difference. On the other hand, in preparation for that, I figured it would be interesting to talk about comparing the Globe and Mail, you know, Canada's main newspaper, with the New York Times. So for a year, I subscribed to the Globe and Mail, which I must say cost about $1,500 or something. And they have practically no subscribers in the United States, and apparently all the subscribers must be rich investors, because every 2 weeks you get a big, fat, glossy book about all the investment opportunities in Canada or something like that. But anyhow, for a year, I read the Globe and Mail every day, and I read the Times every day, and all the other junk. And I figured at the beginning it'd be an interesting comparison. Okay, it turned out it wasn't an interesting comparison. To read the Globe and Mail is like reading the Boston Globe. The Globe and Mail is like an ordinary quality local newspaper in the United States. Small amount of international coverage, huge amount of business news, and mostly picking stuff off the United States. Now, it's true that over that year, I did find things in the Globe and Mail which did not appear in the United States, or if they appeared somewhere, you know, really remote. And I have friends who clip the Canadian press for me and send me things. And I have friends in the Canadian media. Do you know Linda McQuaig? She was a writer for the Globe and Mail for years, who's written lots. A personal friend, Linda Diebel, who's a very good reporter for the Toronto Star, is a personal friend, does really good stuff, and so on. So, you know, I know some people there, and I do follow it, and I get clippings. And there's some stuff there that doesn't appear here. That's correct. But overall, reading it for a year, it was not, you didn't have a different picture of the world than you would have had from reading the Boston Globe or, you know, the Los Angeles Times or another quality local newspaper. It was more local in orientation, less international than the New York Times. But I didn't feel it was different. It was mostly a business paper. Now, when I go to Canada, I'm on Canadian radio and television a lot, as distinct from here, a lot. But that's because I talk about the United States. And in Canada, they like it when people come up and dump on the United States, because the United States is beating them up all the time, and it's nice if somebody comes and says how rotten the United States is. On the other hand, I got sick of this a couple of times, and I started talking about Canada. And I was off so fast, you couldn't even see it, I mean, the first time I did this, it was on this morning show. Yeah, this guy's name I can never remember. Zosky. I think did you have that in the film? I forget. Yeah, okay. Well, there's this morning show. It's kind of like a nationwide talk show in Canada, which everybody tunes into sometime in the morning. Yeah, something. And every time I would go to Toronto, they'd invite me to come talk on that show, And we would have, like, whatever it is, 15 minutes. And, he asked me some leading questions. I tell him how rotten the United States is, and a big smile. One time I really got sick of it, and I started talking about Canada. And he said something about, I hear you just came. I said, yeah, I landed at the war criminal airport. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, the Lester Pearson Airport. And he said, what do you mean, war criminal? And I started running through, Lester Pearson's the big hero in Canada, So I started running through Lester Pearson's involvement in criminal activities, a major criminal, I mean, really extreme. I mean, he didn't have the power to be like an American president, but if he had, he would have been the same. He tried, And I went through some of this. He got infuriated, and then I said something else about Canada and the Vietnam War. Canada was always denouncing the United States during the Vietnam War for its criminal actions. Meanwhile, Canada became the leading military exporter in the world per capita, enriching itself on the destruction of Indochina. And I mentioned that kind of stuff. He went into a kind of a tantrum. I thought it was sort of funny, but apparently listeners didn't. And when I left, like about after 10 minutes of listening to this harangue, the producer, sort of quivering, stopped me and said, oh my God, the switchboard is lighting up. We're getting thousands of phone calls from all over Canada. And apparently the phone calls were all about, just that he was being impolite. I don't know if people agreed with me particularly, but there was a lot of people angry at the way he was doing it. Like I say, I thought it was comical and didn't bother me. But him, yeah. And they were pretty upset, because they were getting a lot of, he asked me, the producer said, well, look, could you go on again? I said, no, I'm leaving. I'm busy while I'm here, and then I'm going home. I don't have that kind of time. So he said, well, can we call you in Boston to have a follow-up? Which they never do. It's always it's an in-studio program. So I said, yeah, I don't know if you can arrange it. I'll do it. Anyway, they made a big effort, and they called me up in Boston, and we went through another show in which he was very contrite and quiet and so on, just to make up to the audience. And that's the last time I ever heard from him. I've never been on that show again. Well, that's happened to me elsewhere in Canada. I've been in universities where they literally refused to pay my fare after I went and gave talks in which I denounced Canada. Canada is very nice as long as you're criticizing the United States. Try going after Canada and see what happens to you. So I frankly think it works the same. I don't think it works the same in detail, like there's a labor movement and there are other things and so on, but I doubt that the differences are very great.
Well, there's a lot of difference, like from the perspective of an activist trying to get things on the news.
Sure, but that's because there's popular movement. There's a labor movement. Canada has a labor movement. It makes a big difference. It has a social democratic party, which brings together, maybe everybody thinks the NDP is rotten, but it's a forum that brings people together, like feminists and ecologists and labor activists. They're all together in the NDP somehow. It's like a framework in which they can interact somehow. And the United States doesn't have those things, and that makes a big difference. That you can see the differences, and sometimes you can even trace it. Like take, say, healthcare. Well, that's the way healthcare got to Canada. Well, you know better than I do. It started in Saskatchewan, based on a working class movement. I think it may have had an NDP government at the time. Anyway, they put it through, and it worked so well it spread, and so on and so forth. That didn't happen in the United States. This is a business-run society. Canada, in this respect, is more like continental Europe, which has a kind of social contract of some sort, especially Northern Europe. like Scandinavia. And it's largely based on, I think, on the labor movement. But when you get to the media, I really doubt that they'd be all that different. These, from the experiences I've had. You could try. Or you could ask some of the reporters. I've heard some pretty unpleasant stories from friends in the Canadian media. Yeah. Oh, you do? Yeah. Easy. It's easy if you want. I'm like the people I mentioned would be happy to talk to you. I'm sure.
There's hands over there as well.
Yeah, sorry.
I just really have a short question. About 2 months ago, there was a report on NPR, which I do listen to, telling about some kind of institute that had produced a report that indicated that the United States was like 13th, rated 13th in the free press. Do you hear about it?
But it could be. What criteria would these? Yeah. Anybody see it? Yeah. You don't remember what criteria they used and that kind of stuff?
No, and that's what I'm interested in finding out.
Yeah, it would.
One of the things that was in the report was ownership.
It's
Okay.
concentration of ownership. Oh, yeah.
Consolidation of
Yeah. Well, sure. I mean, because after, if you, did they mean just the print press or everything?
I don't know.
Yeah.
All I know
Because
is
if it,
that internationally, we were 13th.
well, I mean, if it includes things like radio and television, then of course the United States is going to be way down because we have nothing, essentially nothing public. If it includes print press, it's not so clear. Like in Australia, I think it's 100% Rupert Murdoch now, or just something awful close to that. France is about 80% monopolized, I think. I don't know what, we're not that different. It's a little different in England. In England, it's a bit different, but very much narrowing.
I'm just interested because I think that there's a very pervasive myth that we have the freest press in the world.
Well, in some respects, it's true. It's not totally false. We have the freest press in the world, I think, in the sense of freedom from government constraints. So in England, say the government can go into the BBC office and shut them up and steal their files, and it has strong weapons it can use against free expression. Same in Canada. Like, Canada stopped Salman Rushdie's book for a while. Finally let it in, but it stopped it because of Canadian laws. Canada jailed some guy recently for what they call false news. That's a law that goes back to 1275 when it was used to protect the king, distributing false news, some nutty Holocaust revisionist. You couldn't do that in the United States. And that's, in that sense, the United States probably is unique. And France is one of the worst, but most of the world is like that. So there are respects in which it's true, and that again reflects the fact that it's a business-run society. Business does not want a powerful state which will interfere with it. Okay, so you get a lot of civil liberties follow from that.
I had this question for a long time, and not to belabor the point of how embarrassed you are or aren't about being in that film, but I think that some people would argue, for example, gerrymander, that there's something inherent about the technology of the way the media is that creates that sort of celebrityism and creates sort of a society of the spectacle. And there's a very good book called The Society of the Spectacle that details in sort of an abstract way how things like that create audience-like behavior. I'm curious because this is a media institute, and what we are trying to do is through alternative media disseminate progressive viewpoints, how we can, as alternative media activists, not recreate those authoritarian structures, not have like a Z channel that competes with Fox and ABC.
Yeah, I think you're right. Absolutely right. Yeah.
How to be egalitarian and to try to disseminate information.
Yeah. I think that's exactly the crucial point. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I'd be interested in what some of you have to say about it. But how would one make a comparable film, let's say, which would really bring out, how social change really takes place? The only place I don't see a lot of visual stuff, so I'm not the best commentator, but you know, there were things, films like, say, Salt of the Earth comes to mind, which really did it, I thought. And of course it was killed, you know. I mean, I think it was almost never shown. Salt of the Earth was one of the really great movies. Actually, it came out at the same time as On the Waterfront, which is a rotten movie. And On the Waterfront became a huge hit because it was anti-union, you know. So it was like, On the Waterfront was part of a big campaign that was going on to try to destroy unions while pretending to be for the, you know, Joe Sixpack. So the story of On the Waterfront is, it's a, you know, this Marlon Brando or somebody stands up for the poor working man against the corrupt union boss. Okay, things like that exist, you know, but that's not unions. But since it had that message, and it combined an anti-union message with standing up for the poor working man, it became a huge hit. On the other hand, Salt of the Earth, which came out at the same time and which was an authentic and very well done movie about a strike, and the people who were involved in it and so on, I mean, I think that was just flat killed. I don't even think it was shown anywhere. I mean, like, you could see it at an art theater, I guess.
When did it come out? 20 years later, the show.
Was it? Yeah. But I don't know what you guys think, but those of you who know something about film, but I thought it was really well done film. Yeah. Yeah.
When did it come out?
Around 1953, I guess it must have been, early 50s. It came out almost the same time as On the Waterfront, I remember that, yeah.
And the power different today than in the past, and what kind of ideas would you have for what we have to be considering or taking into account of that power and right wing?
Well, I mean, you know, things are never exact. I mean, I don't. At some level, it's not very different, but it's true that things do change. So in the '60s, I mean, if you look through American history, there's kind of like a cycle that goes on of popular unrest and, you know, activism and some victories and then a counter reaction to try to beat it down. So in the 1890s, there was a period of progressivism. There was a big progressive movement in the Midwest, a lot of radical farmers. There was progressive history, you know, a lot of critical analysis, and it was beaten down by repression. In fact, there was a big emigration of farmers from Midwest U.S. to Canada, where in fact they formed part of the progressive movements in Canada. You know, the radical farmers from the United States were just beaten down when the progressive movement was defeated, the populist movement it was at the time. And then there was like a period of quiescence. Around the First World War, wars have a way of getting people to think, you know, so you get a lot of activism and stuff. After the First World War, there was incidentally, right at that time, like in the 1990s, there was also very harsh repression. I mean, destruction of unions and very violent and so on, so it was mixed. Around the First World War, there was again an upsurge at the end of the First World War of organizing, union activism, you know, independent press and so on. At that point came Wilson's Red Scare, which was very tough. I mean, thousands of people were simply kicked out of the country. You know, the main labor leader in the country, Eugene Debs, was just stuck in jail for 10 years. It was very harsh repression, you know, like not death squads, but harsh, more than you get in most industrial countries, I should say. And it led to a period of quiescence. So for and everybody figured at that point it's over. Business is won. You know, there was a period of great triumphalism in the 20s. No more labor, no more dissidents. Everybody's obedient. Then came the Depression, and everything sort of came out of the woodwork again. And you had, you know, the CIO organizing and a lot of struggle and so on. And there were some real victories. By the late 30s, it was already the counter-reaction was taking place. There was a big business reaction. They started killing strikers again. Roosevelt shifted, you know, moving away from the New Deal. Then the war came along and sort of stopped it for a few years. Right after the war came a big reaction. You know, that's the continuation of the late 1930s reaction to the popular struggles that led to the New Deal legislation. By 1948, Taft-Hartley bill comes along, labor movement is practically killed, you know. By then it's tied in with the Cold War. Later McCarthy came along. It's called McCarthyism, but that's kind of misleading. McCarthy was sort of a latecomer. This was the liberals mostly. It was the Truman administration, the ADA, the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. They're the ones who spearheaded it. In fact, they were kind of formed to sort of mobilize the population in support of power in the Cold War, and they continued that way. So, for example, as late 1967, I'll tell you if you like the details, they would not let people like Howard Zinn and me even join ADA because they were afraid that we would speak up in favor of an anti-war resolution that was coming. Literally, the whole of ADA in Massachusetts was paralyzed for 3 months while they were trying to figure out a way to keep from accepting our $5 applications for membership, which is what it takes to join, because they were afraid. There was a couple of trade unionists who were putting in a resolution against the war, and the ADA is run like the Communist Party. And so there's a Politburo, a central committee, which makes all the decisions, and everybody's supposed to ratify them. And it looked like they might get something from the floor, which was an anti-war resolution. This was late '67. They wouldn't let us join because out of fear of that. It's an interesting story, I'll tell you if you like. Anyhow, that came this post-war repression. Again, in the 50s, everything looked very quiet. Okay, then the 60s come along. Civil rights, the Vietnam War, big ferment, popular movements. Instantly, the reaction set in. It's this normal cycle. By the early 1970s, there was a big attempt to reconquer the ideological sphere. And it took many different forms. One form was the rise of these right-wing think tanks and other techniques to try to monopolize discussion. It's always right-wing, but because that's the society, it's a business society, but they want to move it even further to the right. So move everything even further to the right. In fact, it's at this stage that things like laissez faire started coming back in after literally over a century of being a bad word. This is also connected with things going on in the international economy and so on and so forth. Anyhow, comes this big assault in the late 70s, big ideological assault. It's interesting that this time it didn't work. It worked among elites. It did not work among the population. So the activism continued. You get all the popular movements continuing. In fact, even grew. They're bigger in the 70s and the 80s than they were in the 60s. And this caused a lot of concern. In my opinion, that's the source of all this PC hysteria. I think that's a reflection of a kind of a tantrum over the fact that it's been impossible to crush all this stuff. That it's kind of like a tantrum. It's not that some of the things they say aren't true. Yeah, sure, some of them are true. But what the real problem is that the effort to take 100% control of the ideological system didn't work. And since the mentality is basically totalitarian, any break in it is considered a huge tragedy. Like 98% isn't enough. You have to have 100%. These are totalitarian strains. And they couldn't get it, especially among the general population. They have not been able to beat back all of the popular movements, which simply led to a lot of concern with sexism and racism and environmental issues and respect for other cultures and all this bad stuff. It led to real hysteria. So you get this kind of PC comedy. And that's the right wing. Very organized, a lot of resources going into it. You take a look at the universities, they're flooded with, Olin professorships of free enterprise and, this and that, glossy right-wing newspapers which are given out. Right-wing, like crazy right-wing, given out free to every student and so on. Meanwhile, everybody's screaming about the left has taken over, and it's out of hysteria that they have not got total control. In fact, probably lost most of the population by now. So that's roughly where it is, I think. And it's part of a kind of a cycle that's going on for a long time. And this cycle is unusual in the sense that in that the control, it simply hasn't worked. Like this period is not quiescent the way the 50s and the 20s and the early part of the century was.
Did you have any ideas about what we could be doing or should be doing?
Yeah,
into consideration about that?
Sure. Look, I don't think there's been a better period in modern history for organizing. There's tremendous disillusionment. It's worldwide, incidentally. Like there have been some cross-national studies, and the level of pessimism in the world, in the industrial world, is extraordinary. I mean, in the United States, for example, about 3/4 of the population thinks the future is going to be objectively worse than the past. Their children won't live like they do, in other words. And incidentally, this feeling is true among young people, too. You know, overwhelmingly, they don't expect to live as well as their parents. I mean, you know, economically. That's probably could well be objectively correct. Those are new things in the history of industrial society. About half the population thinks that both political parties ought to be disbanded. They're useless. The disaffection from institutions keeps going up, you know, and it's always up. You know, I mentioned this morning over 80% of the population thinks the economic system is inherently unfair, meaning should just be changed. Nothing you can do about it. You know, these are conditions under which organizing for social change ought to be, you know, very much possible. If we're not doing it, it's our fault. You know, it's not been true in the past. It's also true that people feel hopeless. Now, part of the disillusionment is they just feel hopeless. They don't see anything else. You know, they don't have the kind of. I mean, even in the depths of the 1930s depression, which was objectively much worse than today, you know, people never were hopeless. I mean, the most, you know, people felt it's going to get better. You know, we can do something about it. We can organize. We can work. They had illusions too, like, you know, there were illusions about Roosevelt, for example. But there were illusions, and there was something real going on, and there was a sense of hopefulness, which there isn't today. Today, what people mainly feel is it's going to get worse, and there's nothing we can do about it. So it's a combination of, you know, high degree of disillusionment and a very low degree of hope and perception of alternatives, and that's exactly where serious organizers ought to be able to step in.
Actually, in a way, it seems sort of obvious, but I'm interested as a high school student on your take on how the public education system here in the States, at elementary and middle school, in particular the high school level, serves to reinforce these concepts of mass media, and also how it makes students very dormant as far as political act.
Well, I mean, you know, every one of you has been through school just like I have, and I'm sure your experience is not very different from mine. The school system overwhelmingly, it has some, well, let me start with a story. A friend of mine, my oldest personal friend, you know, a guy who's been friends for 50 years, happens to have come from Latvia. And he came to the United States when he was about 15. He was just got out 3 minutes before the Germans came in. Jewish, you know, so he would have ended up in a concentration camp. But he made it. And when he came here, he went to the school, same kind of school in New York that I went to in Philadelphia, the school for bright Jewish kids who were going to college, you know, that kind of thing. And he once told me that his most striking impression when he got to school, this fancy school for kids going to college, is that he discovered that if he got a C in an exam, nobody cared. But if he came 2 minutes late, he was called down to the principal's office. You know, and it sort of at once told you the values. You know, the values are you're going to be a factory worker somewhere. You know, like maybe they'll call it a university, but you're going to be a factory worker following somebody else's orders. And the important thing is discipline. You know, it's not figuring things out or, you know, understanding things. That's kind of marginal. But make sure that you meet the requirements that are of a real factory. And that's pretty much what schools are like. They reward discipline and obedience. They punish independence of mind. I mean, I can remember this as a student. You challenge what the teacher says, you get thrown out of class. If you repeat every bit of nonsense that he said, you know, verbatim, you get an A. And it doesn't take, you know, and you just learn that. I mean, and in fact, my rough impression, I can't quantify it, is that I talk in a lot of colleges, when you talk in the elite colleges, the students are often much more disciplined and obedient. And I think there's a selection for obedience. You know, I mean, people who have not met that selection process are weeded out somewhere along the line. And some people do it because they figure, okay, I'll do any stupid thing that asshole says because I want to get ahead. Others do it because you just internalize it. And after a while, these things tend to get sort of blurred, you know. But you do it or else you're out. You ask too many questions and you're in trouble, you know. And I think that's essentially what the schools are for. So sure, they're part of the system of ensuring obedience and discipline. Actually, I think it's going to get worse, because there's now part of this right-wing offensive is an effort to destroy the school system on the grounds that that contributes to freedom. It's coercive to have a school system. You should have it in the market, because the market's where everything's free. And this is part of the same idea as always, to destroy normal human emotions. I mean, a normal human being who's not pathologically deformed would want to live in a society where other people's children get an education, right? But if you've really become pathologically deformed, you're not even human anymore. The only thing you care about is whether your children get an education. It doesn't matter what happens to the kid down the block. Okay? Now, if you can turn people into that kind of monster, then they're under control. And the idea of privatizing education on the basis of free choice is that, basically. It's what it comes down to. Saying, look, we have no sense that we want to live in a place where kids have opportunities. You just want to maximize your own welfare, personally, in a very narrow sense of welfare, meaning you're a kid. If you live behind a barbed wire fence with 39 cops to keep you from getting killed, that's welfare, too, as long as you have a lot of stuff. Now, if you can get people to believe that sort of thing, then, that's just another step towards this project since the 19th century, early 19th century, of trying to drive ordinary human feelings out of people's heads. And that's what the privatization of education story is about. And, of course, it comes with all sorts of nice rhetoric and freedom and liberty and that kind of business. But that's, I don't know if your experience is different, but that's like my experience and every experience I know of pretty much with schools. There are, like my kids say, same thing, they went to good schools, they, got to colleges and so on and so forth, but it was mainly sort of doing what you're told. Do what you're told, you don't get into trouble.
We know something about the reprehensible behavior of powerful elites in the U.S. and the wider world, and I'm hearing all sorts of things that I didn't know about their behavior here domestically. There seems to be a difference of degree, the same strategy but worse out there. Could you comment on what it is what factors traditionally have kept it softer for the people here, and also in light of what I think you've called the third worldization of the United States, could you maybe project what the effect will be on those factors that have protected us so strong?
Well, I mean, what kept it softer here, take, say, the United States or Britain. I mean, they got freedom through popular revolutions. England had big revolutionary struggles in the 17th century. The United States had them in the 18th century. It just went on, I mean, this was a slave country. There was a huge war, monstrous war, in which there were enormous casualties and destruction, which was part of keeping it from being a slave country. That's pretty far, It's a lot of repression, slavery. The rights that the population have, they won through struggle. It was never given as a gift by anyone. Now, in third world countries, there's plenty of struggle, but there's also plenty of force to stop it, because there's bigger powers like us who will come in and make sure that local elites win the battle. There was no Mars around bigger than us that could come in to help American elites crush the population. So therefore, the struggle was just internal. There was no outside force that could come in and force one result rather than another. Like there wasn't any outside, maybe England would have liked to intervene in the 1860s to keep slavery in the South, because they actually gained from it, but they were in no position to do so, even if they wanted to. So here, in the rich countries, you don't have external interference to the same extent. In U.S. domains, let's say in Latin America, anytime anybody tries to raise their head, the local elites will go after them, and if they can't get away with it, the United States will come in and do it for them. Now, we're so much more powerful that the issue doesn't arise. So that's why it's much tougher in the third world. As the United States becomes more of a third world society itself, we'll have to move in that same direction. And you can see it right in front of your eyes. Take, say, the crime bill. What's the crime bill about? Well, it's just another step towards making us like a third world society. By now, I think close to 1 million people are in prison. It's by far the highest per capita prison population, I think, certainly in the industrial world, in the whole world probably. And it's going up, and it's going way up, in fact. The new crime bill is very harsh. Just today, Massachusetts approved the death penalty. We're one of the few countries of the industrial world that has a death penalty, and it's extending because we have to become more like El Salvador. We've got a bigger and bigger population that's going to have to be controlled by force. And the force is things like prisons and police and security forces and so on. And yeah, I think that's exactly the direction you'd expect us to go as the more and more of the population becomes superfluous, useless for wealth production. But I think you can see why third world countries they have problems that a first world country, the population in a first world country doesn't have. Namely, they have us to come in and help out in crushing popular revolts. I mean, in Central America, say in the 1970s and 80s, you could have had significant steps towards democracy and freedom and human rights and so on, but the U.S. just organized a massive terror war to stop it. Now that doesn't happen. Actually, we're seeing the same thing right now in Haiti, or in Colombia, let's say. Take, say, Colombia, which nobody reads much about. Colombia is, technically speaking, a democracy. It's also got the worst human rights record in the hemisphere. I mean, there is an independent political party there. About 2,000 of its members, including all of its political leaders, have been murdered by the security forces. Labor union leaders are murdered. Students or dissidents are murdered, and so on. It's now the worst human rights record in the hemisphere. It's getting more than half of U.S. military aid. And it's going up under Clinton because they need it. They got to crush dissidents. In Haiti, as soon as Aristide got elected, the only question that any sane person should have asked is, how's the United States going to get rid of him? Because that's not tolerable in our sphere. A populist movement based on grassroots support and a priest who's infected with liberation theology. That won't last. And the only question is how they're going to get rid of him. Okay, he was gotten rid of by a coup, and ever since then the question has been, how do you keep him from getting back into power? And it's still a question. That's the problem in a third world country. I mean, in Haiti, for example, there were lively, vibrant, popular movements. They won an election. They got smashed.
How exactly? You really get that there's some serious effort there being made to get Aristide back. You think they're going to try to get him back, and then so it doesn't last?
Well, Aristide. First of all, take a close look at what's happening. They made a very interesting tacit admission in the last couple of weeks. Aristide was overthrown in September 1991. Okay? Now, there's been a pretense ever since that we've been trying to get him back. An embargo was announced on May 21st. Take a look at the press since May 21st. What they say is that, well, we don't know yet if the sanctions are going to work because they just started. Well, that's true, in fact. The sanctions just started on May 21st, 1994. Okay, so what happened between September 30th, 1991 and May 21st, 1994? It's a long time. Well, what happened is there weren't any sanctions. In fact, we were telling the Haitian military, keep it up, no sanctions, you do whatever you feel like, we're not going to lift a finger. That's now being tacitly conceded as part of the background for possible invasion. But notice that it is being conceded. Like the press does say, and the government says, well, we haven't had time to let the sanctions work. It's only since May 21st. Okay, that, obvious consequence follows from that. Again, you're not going to read it in the newspapers, but you can figure it out. So Aristide had a 6-year term. For the first couple of years, the security forces were set to work to massacre and decimate the popular movements. So they'll be so terrorized that even if he finally is let back in for a couple of months toward the end of his term, he won't be able to do anything about it. There's a kind of a dual-style counterinsurgency operation going on, more or less on the model of Guatemala, from which it may be borrowed from, in fact, which is a combination of state terror and rebuilding of the service sector under the hands of the terrorists. So FRAP, this paramilitary terrorist group, which is the old Tonton Macoute and those guys, they're now organizing clinics and things like that. which U.S. aid is paying for, incidentally, in various indirect ways. And the idea is on the one hand, you murder the leaders, you terrorize the people, and you intimidate them. On the other hand, you set up a clinic, and you say, look, you follow our orders, and your kid won't die from something, because we'll give you medicine. And that combination, that's sort of the Guatemala model, which worked quite well, is essentially what's being done. They may get Aristide back in for a couple of months toward the end, but at a point in which the population is so intimidated and the popular movements are so decimated that there's no way for him to do anything except preside over catastrophe. That's been the plan all along. And what's more, it's virtually conceded. Anybody who says correctly that the sanctions began this May is conceding that for 3 years, 2.5 years, we've been supporting the military. That's what it means.
Does it mean that we help them overthrow?
You don't have to, well, that I don't know. We don't know yet whether the U.S. was involved in the coup. I don't know if they were or not, but it really doesn't matter. The point is the coup took place and the U.S. essentially acted in such a way that it would succeed. There might be. If there's a military intervention, that's the end of any hope for Haitian democracy. Absolute end. It's not to say, maybe the population will get desperate enough so they'll even welcome a military intervention. That could happen. But anybody who thinks it's going to bring about democracy just hasn't looked at a history book. Find a case. There's plenty of history of intervention, plenty, including Haiti. The Marines invaded Haiti in 1915 under the big liberal Woodrow Wilson, who's got idealism coming in. The phrase Wilsonian idealism is like idealism comes automatically. It's like a macro you type on the computer after Wilson, Wilsonian idealism. So, they totally destroyed the constitutional system. And first they reinstituted slavery. They killed a couple thousand people. They were super racist, But why did they destroy the constitutional system? Speaking about democracy, well, very simple reason. The Haitian Constitution had a provision in it which prevented land alienation, purchase of lands by foreign corporations. Like it prevented, it's only American, there's nobody else, prevented American corporations from buying Haiti up and turning it into a plantation. There was a provision in the Constitution that prevented that, and that was considered unprogressive. Wilson was a progressive, remember. So it was highly unprogressive to have this in the Constitution, and therefore the United States wrote a new Constitution. Actually, Franklin Roosevelt took credit for writing it, although he was probably lying. But anyhow, he took credit for it. And the new Constitution overcame this unprogressive legislation. Well, they couldn't get the Haitian Parliament to pass the new American Constitution, so the Marines went in and simply kicked the Parliament out by, as the Major General put it, by Marine Corps methods, Smedley Butler, this was, famous man, incidentally, later turned. But they got rid of the Parliament. Then under Marine rule, they ran a referendum in which 5% of the population participated, and I think it passed with, 99.98% of the vote or something like that. And that was considered democracy, And so then they had the new Constitution, and then American corporations could buy up the country, which they did. The end result of 20 years of Marine occupation was the whole place is a U.S.-owned plantation, super racist. The main thing that the U.S. did was create a military force to control the population. They didn't have one before. They had an army, but it was to defend against, it was like for foreign wars or something. But the U.S. did what it did everywhere. It did the same thing in the Dominican Republic, the other half of the island at the same time. Established a National Guard whose task is to fight the population. Meanwhile, they disarmed the population. So the population was disarmed, the security force was set up to control them. That was 20 years of intervention. That's why when you go to Haiti now, I don't know if some of you have been there, you talk to people who are really under the whip, and they do not want an American intervention because they know what it means. You don't have to study it in history books. Poor people don't have the luxury that we have. They can't live in a fairy tale world like rich people can. They have to live in the real world. And in the real world, certain things happen, and they happen quite systematically. And one of the things that happens systematically is that when a big power intervenes, it intervenes for its purposes, not for the purposes of the people there. So, if the U.S. sends in the army, it'll stop the terror. It'll also end any hope for democracy. I mean, what they'll have is democracy run by the people who are called the moderates in the press. There's a name for them. There's a group called the moderates. Those are the rich businessmen, you know, running the big families with the gold-plated Cadillacs and so on, but they come in two categories. There's one category who thinks you ought to torture people and massacre them and cut their faces off and so on. They're the extremists. And then they're the kind that say they ought to work for 10 cents an hour in assembly plants, you know, where they stick their hands in toxic waste and die after a couple of years and make a lot of money for American importers. Those are the moderates. And they're the guys who are supposed to run the place. And they will if we go in. It'll be called democracy. They'll even have a vote and they'll win the election, you know.
Coming from Switzerland, I do have a question about the process which is called the European integration. I mean, like more and more concentration of power in Brussels, more and more bureaucracy. How do you judge this process going on in Europe?
Well, you know, there's a name for what's going on. In fact, in the European lingo, it's called the democratic deficit. And what's happening, in fact, is that as you get more and more centralization of power, you lose popular control. That is, when power is going somewhere, it's coming from somewhere else, you know. And where it's coming from is parliamentary institutions. So to whatever extent the parliamentary institutions represent popular power, and to some extent they do, they're losing it into the hands of what the business press, in fact, calls a de facto world government, which consists of the international bureaucracy and their constituency. Their constituency is essentially transnational corporations. So in Europe, as it's getting integrated, it's absolutely like you say. I mean, power is going up to the international bureaucracy, which is closely linked with the Swiss-based, in fact, you know, IMF, World Bank, etc., bureaucracy. And there's an interesting reaction to it. One reaction is this development of regionalization. So there's a lot of growth all over Europe. You know, you find a lot of increase in, you know, sort of trying to devolution, you know, reduce power down to the regions. So you find it everywhere. I mean, like you go to Wales or Catalonia or almost any place you like, there's an increase in involvement in traditional culture, you know, and traditional, everything from folk songs to control of your own political institutions. You find it just about everywhere. I don't know if it's true in Switzerland, but you certainly find it all over the place. And it's a reflection of, I think, in my view, it's a reflection of it's a reaction to the centralization. You know, as you get centralization and transfer of power over to a transnational-based bureaucracy, you're also getting a popular reaction, and the popular reaction is towards regionalization and federalism. Now, you know, it's in a way it's a counterpart to what's going on in Eastern Europe, but Eastern Europe is extremely poor and beaten down and so on. So when they have regionalization, they murder each other. When you have regionalization in Belgium, which is a rich country, they don't murder each other, but it's pretty unpleasant. You know, I mean, it takes other forms. But you know, if Belgium was a much poorer country, it would look like Bosnia right now, in my opinion. It's a much richer country, so there are all kind of ways of covering up the hatreds and that sort of thing. But you can see it, you know, very definitely, and it has, you know, has good aspects and bad aspects, like most nationalism does. A good aspect is the increase in commitment to an authentic, you know, integrated, meaningful community, and so, with its own culture, etc. That's all to the good. The bad aspect is the hatred of the guys on the other side, and those things tend to go together. Overcoming them is a big task, but it's possible. Actually, speaking of freedom, I'll give you a story about Switzerland. I was just there about a week ago. I gave a talk for Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, NGOs, you know, sort of third world-oriented NGOs, and the talk was supposed to be in a university, but they had to move it. They moved it to CERN, which is the you know, the high-energy physics place, because CERN is international territory, and it isn't under the control of the Swiss police. The universities are under the control of the Swiss police. And when they heard that I was going to give a political talk in a Swiss university, the police insisted on a text in advance to make sure that I wouldn't say anything that would be disruptive and so on. They were going to monitor it and so on. That's a free society for you.
One of the things that people say to me is the left is not doing anything about this. The left is not addressing the problems of the schools. The left is, is sentimental about the public school system. What would you say to that?
I think there's a lot of truth to it. I mean, if people are, it's the same with the crime thing. I mean, people are really scared. Especially people in poor neighborhoods. It's not so bad where I live, let's say, in the fancy suburbs. But if you live in poor neighborhoods, it's frightening. Unpleasant things can happen to you and your children. And when it's frightening, you want something to protect you. And if protecting you means the death penalty and the death squads and so on, okay, we'll go for them. It's kind of like, and you could argue the same is true of intervention in Haiti. I mean, the people don't want the Marines back, but if the only choice, if democracy's gone, no hope of democracy, and the choice is the Marines or the Tonton Macoute, they'd rather have the Marines. And I think what you're describing is exactly that. If the choices are narrowed to oppression, dumbing down, turning people pathological and so on, or having private choices, they'll pick the private choices. But the task of the left is to extend those options, to say, well, look, there's another option, the option of a decent life, which is neither schools as prisons or you pull yourself out and let everybody else stay in the prison. If those are the only choices, sure, people say, I'll pull myself out. And look, I did the same thing. Why do I live in a suburb? Because we wanted our kids to go to a good school, first person to tell you, So I did that, and people who have the alternative, the choice will do it. And the idea is to set up a system in which you don't have to face that choice. If that's the only choice you have, yeah, people will take it. And the task of the left is to ensure that there isn't just that set of narrow choices, all of them awful. But it's quite true that within that set of awful choices, the left is offering essentially nothing. What it ought to be offering is saying, look, this is not the full range of choices. There are others. And the others are not utopian. Say inner city schools, there was a period in the United States not far back when inner city schools were extremely good. In fact, some of the black schools in Washington in the inner city had some of the highest rate of college acceptances in the country. It's nothing, like I say, my own family, these were immigrants. They came from Eastern Europe, it wasn't like they weren't peasants, but very poor Eastern European background, and they went to ordinary city schools, got through this, some of them got through the city college and so on, and they got a very good education. Can certainly be done. The city college in New York used to be one of the best schools in the country. Public city school. No reason why it shouldn't be. And I think, and of course this depends on what the whole social structure is. You can't come, some of my relatives have been teachers in New York all their lives. And almost without exception, they say that things are much worse now than they ever were. Like in the 1930s, when you were a teacher in a school, you didn't have to worry about kids coming in. The kids didn't come in without food, telling you that their grandmother was sitting next to their bed all night to beat the rats off. It was bad, but it wasn't that bad. And you didn't have to worry about, the fact that when you tried to walk out in the hall, you were going to get killed by some guy high on drugs. It wasn't that bad. These are new things, and that's destroying the cities, and it's destroying them because of a social structure that we just got to change from the bottom up. If there's no way to change it, if people give up the hope of changing it, yes, then they'll pick within the rotten options that are available to them, and I think we have to recognize that. It's true. These people are telling you something true.
Is the ability of capital to exploit being affected or reduced by the rise of large funds like pension funds? So, for example, I'm thinking specifically of South Africa. It had some effect, and it's certainly different than J.P. Morgan, Mellon period. So.
Well, an actual investment is productive in... Yeah, I think we had to go. Okay, question was whether these changing investment patterns and opportunities, and it definitely is, very dramatically. In fact, very dramatically so. Just the numbers themselves are dramatic. So back around 1970, about 90% of the capital involved in international transactions was for more or less productive purposes, production and trade, commercial purposes. And 10% was for speculation. Those figures have reversed. It's now 90% speculation. Furthermore, the amount of such capital has just exploded. Last estimate I saw from the World Bank was about $14 trillion. And that means $14 trillion of money looking for stable currencies and low growth. And that means that, say, South Africa has extremely narrow choices. Because even we just saw it in the United States. The United States having a very sluggish recovery, very sluggish, the slowest recovery since the end of the Second World War, maybe ever, but certainly since then. Sluggish in one respect, that is, there's very low growth and there's very little job creation, and in fact wages are actually going down, but profits are zooming. If you take a look at every year Fortune has one issue, which is devoted to the welfare of the important people, the Fortune 500. And in 1993, they were kind of, very happy. In 1994, they were euphoric. Profits are just going through the sky. Meanwhile, wages are going down, growth is very low, production is very low, and even this slow growth was canceled just a couple of weeks ago because the bond markets, as they put it, signaled that it didn't like the growth. Speculative capital doesn't want growth. What it wants is stable currencies, meaning no growth. And they even talk now openly about the threat of too much growth, the threat of too much employment. It's open, And that's a threat because if you want money to be very stable, you want to make sure that there's nothing around growth. So what's happened is a big drift internationally towards low growth, low wage, high profit economies. Which give very little leeway to countries. Even a rich country like the United States, I don't think they wanted to do much, but if they'd wanted to carry out stimulative policies, it would have been hard in the United States. In South Africa, it's maybe impossible. There was a great article in the London Economist, which is the big free trade top ideology journal. They were writing about what's going on in Eastern Europe, where everybody's voting in socialists and communists into power. But the basic line of the article was, don't worry about it. And then it said, policy is insulated from politics. Okay? Meaning, no matter what games these guys play in the political arena, policy is going to go on exactly the way it is, because we got them by the balls. There's nothing they can do. So they can play all the political games they want. They can pretend they have a democracy if they like, anything they please, as long as policy is insulated from politics. That's what the European Union's about. That's what the trade agreements are about. All these efforts to try to centralize power are part of a system which is geared towards ensuring that policy is insulated from politics. In the World Bank has a term for it too. They call it technocratic insulation. If you read World Bank statements, they talk about the importance studies. They talk about the importance of technocratic insulation. Meaning you got a bunch of technocrats who are essentially employees of the big corporations, and they have to work in insulation from the public. Because if the public gets involved, they may have bad ideas, like having, the kind of economic growth that does things for people instead of profits and all sorts of stupid stuff like that. So therefore, the technocrats have to be insulated. And once they're insulated enough, you can have democracy, because it's not going to matter. And yeah, that's the direction things are going. I gather from last question, and Mike's tired. He wants to go to sleep. He's been signaling to me wildly, yawning for the last half hour.
Very straight, direct question. Do you think there's any hope for the passage of significant gun control laws?
Look, there's hope for overthrow of the capitalist system. Yeah, there's hope for anything. If you do something about it. Last question.
Comment on that. There seems to be a little split here, especially in the left. We're talking about in one case where the elites win by disarming the populace and then marching the stormtroopers in. Are we really sure that we want to eliminate the Second Amendment?
Well, that's part of the system of illusion in the United States. First of all, the Second Amendment doesn't say anything about having guns. Second Amendment says something about militias, okay, and there is no militias around, so that's irrelevant. Furthermore, you know, the problem in the United States, if the population of the United States was completely armed, everybody had an assault rifle, or 15 of them, if the state wanted to move in, it wouldn't make the slightest bit of difference, because they're going to move in with tanks and nuclear weapons and stuff that you don't have. So the idea that people are going to defend themselves from the state is just outlandish in the United States. It's true that this is widely held all over the place. You hear it all over the country. We have to have guns to defend ourselves from those guys in Washington who are going to come in, you know, the way they came into Iraq. It's not going to make any difference if they felt like coming in, you know, it doesn't make any difference how many guns you have in your closet. So the idea that guns are there to protect people from an oppressive state is just outlandish, and given the distribution of power here.
Well, I went back recently and read the Federalist Papers and the sections under militia, and what Hamilton seems to have had in mind is that initially, first of all, the Constitution forbade a standing army. So he was saying, no matter how rich the federal government got, the armed militia, whatever they...
Yeah, but we don't have any armed militias anymore, and we do have a standing army. And furthermore, that standing army is going to crush anybody in its way. And given the fact that there's no militias, and there's a standing army which has the capacity to destroy everything if it hangs together, that the Second Amendment is essentially irrelevant. But it does not say citizens can have assault rifles. It doesn't say anything about that. It says to bear arms for the purposes of militia. Yeah, and there's no militias.
Well, define the militia, I think, as a certain segment of the male population.
Which is organized. Yeah, but we don't have that, and we're not going to have it. Yeah. So it just doesn't apply. Yeah.